everyone, this is Hazel and you're listening to the Strong Mind podcast. In this episode, Angus and I speak with Emma Wood. Emma Wood is one of the smartest and most experienced people working in the space of psychology in climbing. She's a coach, hypnotherapist, trainee sports psychologist, and recently started a PhD exploring fear and performance anxiety in risky sports. We could definitely talk to Emma all day. We tried to focus the conversation around what we can learn from Emma's work with competition climbers, but we definitely do go off in different directions. I think what's really cool about this conversation is that we discuss many tools, strategies, and mindset takeaways that we can all benefit from, not just competitors. We talk a lot about the concepts surrounding performance, such as mastery, motivation, pressure, confidence, process versus outcomes, fear of failure, self-worth, the capacity of trying hard, and much more. We also talk about our community and how there's little understanding around psychological concepts, including psychological risk, including trauma experiences. We often tend to focus on the tangible things in climbing, like how to tie knots or how to move up the wall. But very few leaders and teachers in our community know much about how to manage fear and stress, to the detriment of many people, especially newer and younger climbers. Emma also just wrote an interesting piece about perfectionism that you can read on the Strong Mind website under News and Insights. This episode is the first half of the conversation. You can listen to the whole conversation by becoming a podcast member. You can do so at strongmindclimbing.com/podcast, and for just $8 a month, you can listen to all of the bonus content that we are creating, including the second half of some of these conversations. You can also attend our live podcast events. You can suggest future guests and also ask them questions. To access even more mental training content, events and coaching, you can become a full Strong Mind member by going to strongmindclimbing.com and finding the community page. All right, thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoy this conversation and have a great rest of your day. All right, so Hazel here, and I'm sat with Emma Wood and Angus Kill. And myself and Angus are just going to talk to Emma about her experiences with competition climbers. And we talk about sort of the different challenges that competition climbers face specifically, but also how some of those issues might help the rest of us as well who don't compete. But first off, it would be great, Emma, if you just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of like your professional background in psychology.
Yeah, no worries. So I've been climbing for about 10 years, just recreationally for fun with friends, family, that kind of stuff. But professionally, I did my undergrad in psychology at Bristol UWE about, I don't want to think how long ago now, a while back. Then got really heavily into climbing, working in climbing walls, did a tiny bit of coaching, tried most jobs in climbing, I think it's fair to say.
Okay.
Got really interested in fear.
Yeah.
And mainly because my head game was shocking.
Okay.
Ended up training as a hypnotherapist, worked in that capacity for about 4 years. And then
Hypnotherapist or a cognitive hypnotherapist?
Cognitive hypnotherapist, I should say.
So maybe let us know what that is.
Yeah. So hypnotherapy is very hard to define. There's many schools of thought, but how I was trained in a particular way.
Yeah.
And that's labelled cognitive hypnotherapy. So that is sort of solution-focused, very person-centred approach, which I recognise are buzzwords. But that just means we try and look at what the most positive outcome would look like for that individual person.
Okay.
And I let that outcome be directed by the person in front of me.
Okay.
So I'm not imposing my own views of what a successful outcome would be. I'm trying to find out for them what that would be.
Right, yeah.
Rather than just focusing on a problem that is presented.
I mean, that's really similar to coaching, which is what we're both trained at. It's definitely more in the positive psychology space of the person's not a problem. They just might have some issues that they want help finding solutions to, but it's not like the person is a problem, I suppose.
Completely. That I would completely hold that as well. I guess the only difference, well, that's a whole thing we could get into about the difference between coaching and therapy. So let's maybe park that one, because that could take the whole time.
Totally.
But I guess the difference with what I do, I don't know, maybe you guys do this as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would kind of create a specific script for each individual and then create a guided hypnosis, which, to be honest, sometimes I struggle to see the difference between a guided meditation and a hypnosis. The only difference that I've ever witnessed is that with hypnosis, you tell them it doesn't matter what they think about. So it's not focusing your attention in that way.
Right, yeah.
Whereas I know mindfulness is about more kind of guiding your attention.
Right, yeah.
That's the main difference. Otherwise, it is somebody talking to you and trying to embed some positive messages.
Yeah.
Which is pretty similar.
We don't do script work in coaching. But yeah, the whole conversational part.
The underlying premise is really similar.
The approach, I guess, the philosophy around how you view the person and what's the outcome in the space is similar, but the methods used are quite different. Yeah, I'm really interested in what those scripts and those meditations might sound like.
I mean, it's a funny one because they take quite a lot of energy and time to put together, but I've found them to be really surprisingly effective. Even now, I've been doing this for years and I'm still shocked at how just the scripting alone can be enough to bring about change for people.
That's cool.
Because essentially you're saying, okay, if I could snap my fingers and give you exactly what you wanted to be doing now, what would that look like? And it's just priming them to notice those details when they do happen.
Right, yeah.
So the more it happens, the more you notice it, the more you expect it. Mm-hmm. And it kind of grows from there.
Right, that's interesting. That sounds a lot like NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know the differences between the two, though.
Well, technically, NLP is part of my cognitive hypnotherapy training.
Right.
NLP, I think, is really controversial.
Yeah, it seems to be.
It gets a really bad rap, but there are some aspects of it, like anchoring, which is where you take a kind of positive past memory and you use it to conjure that feeling in the moment now. That is widely used in sports psychology. You won't find many sports psychologists who don't use that. Yeah. Because it's such a basic skill. Mm-hmm. But in the same breath, we'll say, NLP's rubbish, when that is an NLP technique.
Yeah.
So I think there are some bits which have been demonstrably shown not to be true.
Right.
If that's fair. I'll probably get absolutely shot down in flames for saying that. But there's bits of it which are not backed by evidence, but there are some aspects of it which I think do stand up. So I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are elements which I have found to be effective and do now have growing evidence basis for, but I wouldn't accept it wholesale as an approach.
Right, okay.
But that's super controversial. I'm a bit like, oh God, what have I said?
Yeah, I don't know enough about it to say one way or the other, but I do know a few NLP practitioners and some of their work sounds pretty interesting. Let me just leave it there.
Probably safer.
Continue with your story.
I'll try and keep it brief. I then basically worked out you can't go above a certain point in terms of professional athletes working with organisations and stuff without certain qualifications and boxes ticked. So I decided to go and do my MSc at Sheffield Hallam. And I've now enrolled on, with a bit of a gap because of the pandemic, I'm enrolled on the British Psychological Society pathway to becoming a kind of fully qualified sports psychologist, which is, you can do it in 2 years, but I've decided to do it in 3. And I also literally just started a PhD as well, which means I'm going to be kept pretty busy. Yeah. But it does overlap with the qualification because of the subject matter that I'm looking at.
Okay.
So, I think that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah. I mean, in 5 years' time, you're going to be so certified.
I know. And
you're almost going to be just overqualified for anything you could possibly do in climbing.
You say that, but I think weirdly, it's those sports which are slightly more on the fringe, if I can call climbing that actually are the most complicated to work with and need the most skill. Because I was in a meeting the other day with somebody who's kind of much earlier in their training pathway than I am. And I was quite taken aback that they didn't see the nuance in what they were talking about, if that makes any sense. So they couldn't see what they couldn't see.
Right.
And I think for me, the most complicated part in psychology is the unintended consequences of what you're doing. You can give advice in really good faith and really think it's going to help the person, but it can have a really unexpected negative effect.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's only experience and training that are going to help you bracket that a little bit. So kind of closing down those negative unintended consequences where possible.
Totally. And I think that's what I quite like about coaching, is because it comes from a place of being non-advisory. You don't run into that risk as much, right? We're not telling people what to do with regards to their psychology so much. It's really just a conversation. But also what's interesting about climbing is that there's really specific psychological challenges that actually you probably wouldn't cover in any academic training, potentially. I don't know. Like fear of falling. I mean, it's weird though, because in a way, like fear acquisition, fear conditioning, fear deconditioning is all, like, that's probably one of the most researched areas of psychology, right? But still specific to climbing. I mean, how much good research has been done? Probably not much. I've looked at some of it, and the samples are always super small. It's not really been done that well, in my opinion, but maybe you've seen some better work than I have.
I mean, I think this is where I'm kind of battling, because this is basically the area that I'm hoping to do my PhD in, is looking at, not just in climbing, but generally looking at fear where there is risk.
Yeah.
There's not much in that area. And actually, to be honest, there's not much on fear. I found a really interesting paper, which I now can't remember the details of classically, but they interviewed a lot of people who do, I think it was mountaineering, and they were looking at the kind of hallmarks of what draws people to those skills.
Right, yeah.
And it was a really interesting reinterpretation of fear and fear management, which I think was actually far more on the money than most of the other research I've seen, which is basically looking at people going, you're a bit weird, how are you able to do that? That's the kind of premise.
Yeah, it's like
you're a thrill
interviews
seeker.
and it's othering, isn't it? Yeah. A lot of that research. Or it's like lab-based stuff, which obviously you can't ever be in an actual risky environment. I think some of the stuff, I don't know if you know the Huberman guy, Andrew Huberman. He's like a neuroscientist, and he's done a lot of work explaining neuroscience concepts to the general public. And his lab's done some really cool stuff with VR, actually. So they've simulated, for example, you're in water tank and you've got the VR goggles on, sharks coming towards you. And they've been measuring everything that's going on in the brain and stuff like that. So that's quite cool. Maybe stuff's getting better in neuroscience, but how does that translate to therapy? There's a big gap there, right?
Oh, massively. And that's what I guess has led me to this research question for the PhD, in that I can't find really solid guidance on how to support somebody where you don't know whether it's actually safe or not. Because most of what's out there is based on a clinical idea that fear is irrational.
Oh God, that's a whole extra.
Yeah,
I know.
Open
I know.
can of worms there.
I don't like it when fear gets called irrational.
Me neither. Don't worry, we are on the same page with that.
Perhaps we could just quickly talk about that. Explain.
Well, yeah, I don't know how you feel about it, Emma, but from my perspective, it's like there's a real danger in labeling fear as rational or irrational, because usually when people do that, it comes from this understanding that risk in general is only physical in nature. So like, okay, you can take this giant bungee jump or this huge rope swing because we know everything in the system is safe. So if you're afraid doing it, you're irrational, right? So you should just do it. The problem is that it doesn't take into account psychological damage that could be done from doing those sorts of things. But also it just doesn't really help, because I think it comes from a really misguided idea about what human psychology actually looks like. And I think it comes from this idea that, like, if someone tells you, oh, it's irrational, you're safe, But if you still have then this stress response, that just knowing that it's safe, you can just switch that off. It's like our brains just do not work like that. Threat responses are deeply emotional, embedded, like primal, deep brain stuff, that's been a part of our system for like millions of years.
Yeah.
And you can't just switch that off by someone saying to you, you're safe where you are. Like, it might help a little bit, like it might bring the stress signals down a little bit, but it's not a case of just switching it off. Also, you could say, okay, I'm free soloing. It's rational for me to be afraid. Therefore, does that mean I should be afraid? Does that mean having this heightened stress response is actually going to help me?
I completely agree. I think it creates a whole load of extra baggage around a felt experience that's really unnecessary. The only reason I would ever consider it in that way is trying to decide what treatment approach the person needs. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, I have had people come to me in the past where actually what they really need is coaching, as in physical climbing coaching. But a big piece of my work recently has been working with climbing coaches and actually trying to get into their minds this idea of a psychological risk assessment. Because you'd never put a climber that you're coaching on the wall without checking, is this safe? Do they have the skills to be doing this? So why are we not checking the psychological risk of what we're asking our clients to do? And that could be if somebody's going to a competition and there's a strong chance they're going to have an absolute meltdown, it's going to be awful for them. Is it sensible to send them into that environment?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm totally there with you. And you can speak to this, Angus, because Angus is an instructor and takes people out, and so he's really close to the whole guiding world. And psychological risk is never talked about, really, is it?
Yeah, so I'm completely going to put my foot in it here and probably upset all of my friends. But yeah, for me, when one of the big things that drew me to climbing was the psychological side of it. I think really just the first few days, first years, and what still draws me to climbing is the psychological side of it. I think for all of my friends and climbers and clients and everything, everyone's kind of interested in the psychological side of it. But when in my instructing capacity and throughout all of my training, almost exclusively only talked about what we can touch and point at. Carabiners, clovitches, knots. And all of our language is about that. And when a client is having a stressful experience, we're still only talking about what we can clip or what they can clip, what can be done there. And there is no attention to the psychological side of things at all. And, our whole experience is, what we are and our whole experience and what draws us to climbing, or what we're getting from climbing, or what we can learn from climbing, what's most useful and transferable outside of climbing is all of the psychological stuff. So to me, it does seem like quite a big blind spot. But what I'd like to...
That's an understatement.
But I'm really putting my foot in it there from my instructing point of view. But what I'd like to ask you guys is what you think can be done. What is realistic to ask of an instructor? If
with no psychological training.
Exactly. We do all this training for being instructors, being safe. Is it reasonable to ask us to really understand? We can't be. It's taking you another how many years to become a psychologist? After an undergrad. Can we really expect instructors that are going through 10-day training courses and doing a few years of consolidation and another 5-day assessment? On top of 3 years of experience.
Well, I think there should be a module. For sure, there should be a module. Maybe, Emma, this is you. This is your calling. Create that module. Yeah. Because, at best, you could basically ruin climbing for someone. The amount of times people have gone, I tried climbing when I was a kid and it was terrifying and I've never tried it again since. I've heard that story so many times. And that's because whoever took them climbing didn't understand psychological risk. So that's sort of at best, if you get it wrong, at best the consequences are you could ruin climbing for someone for the rest of their life. At worst, you could create real trauma. And why is that less of a consequence than someone spraining their ankle?
I could not agree more. I think I've got a story from my own life which I think kind of encapsulates that. So I first tried climbing when I was 13. I was born nervous, so climbing was pretty hardcore for me. And they did a 60-foot abseil with us. indoors, so it's all very contained. And I was just having an absolute meltdown at the top of the wall, like crying, like proper having an epic. And so the coaches or instructors at the time said, okay, we'll leave you till last, and we're going to send a coach down with you at the same time. So they're going to be next to you the whole time. I cried the whole way down, but this guy was so supportive that when my feet touched the ground at the bottom, I felt like an achievement, probably more than my degree, more than anything. I peaked at 13. It's not ideal. But it became a really important memory for me about having overcome something.
Right.
So, you know, obviously this guy did I don't even know his name. You know, it's a long time ago, but if they are listening, thanks, mate. Because when it came to, I was about 20, I think, and a friend said, do you want to come climbing? I was like, hell yeah. I felt like an absolute badass. So you can, you know, on the flip side, you don't have to be a psychologist or a therapist to manage and contain that. And like, they weren't afraid of the fact that I was crying. They still were like, we believe you can do this, and we're going to try and meet you where you're at to make this possible for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect, I think, is things like containment. Like, anyone can go away and do a mental health first aid course, and they will teach you how to contain somebody who is really psychologically distressed, I believe. I will fully disclose I haven't done the training, but I have done sort of suicide crisis training.
Yeah, okay.
So actually, and that's for anyone. That's not just for psychologists. And I would really, really recommend that anybody goes and does that training, because you never know if it's going to pop up.
Yeah, totally.
When things like that might happen. But sorry, it's a bit of an aside, really. But I think anybody can learn what to do when somebody is having a really strong emotional reaction to something. And I don't think you have to be a psychologist for that. I think that's almost not a responsibility. That's too strong. But I do think the world would be a better place if we all knew how to do it. Because there's nothing worse when you're faced with somebody who's really in it, really struggling. There's an urgency to the moment that can feel very, very stressful as the other person. And you just want to calm them down as quickly as possible. But when we're panicking, we can then reach for a strategy that's just going to escalate it. Rather than de-escalate it. So if you've at least got a vague idea of what you might do to help that person to calm down, then that's going to really, I can't see how that's going to be detrimental to anyone.
And also, like, a lot of us would probably, there's just like the example of the guy who helped you, that this is a human thing, and I reckon that so many instructors have got good at this. Like, you will have just got good at this just from working with people and being a bit more tuned into it, depending on your personality and your natural tendencies and things. But having just a little module for people who maybe aren't that natural at working with others and containing that kind of situation, just to switch them on a bit. Or, I don't know, it just seems like a good idea.
Well, for everyone to make sure everyone has some base level of, and so that maybe we all learn soft skills, I think, through our work and stuff. And I think many instructors would say that the soft skills are really important and more, or maybe harder to learn, but often make the bigger difference, I think, in their work. For me personally, I found that, everybody can pass an assessment, or everybody that passes an assessment has a certain amount of like hard skills that they can demonstrate, but it's really harder to demonstrate the soft skills, and it just takes a lot longer to learn, and it makes a bigger difference to my work, and that makes a bigger difference to the client, because every instructor has the same level of hard skills, I think, or similar level, reach this threshold, but those soft skills make the bigger difference. I think a lot of instructors could probably relate to that. So I think there is an awareness of the importance of those. But I think if I were to sort of offer the other side here of what most instructors, that I might work with are thinking that the training is already it's a huge training already for, if you're becoming an IFMGA guide, it's massive. Even if you're just becoming an MCI instructor like me, this is in the UK, or like a rock guide, there's already a lot to learn there. And adding more in is like asking quite a lot from, from people. And I think there's also, a lot of this feels kind of new to a lot of people, and there's a bit of, it's, for example, full practice has been done wrong, and it's been offered in quite bad practices, which perpetuates the idea that we shouldn't or can't train ourselves for falling. And so that's to me is quite a big part of it. And so I think that idea has been perpetuated quite a lot in the instructing world, that is not something we should be touching, and it's not our area. Myself, I would say that we already are bringing people into psychologically challenging areas. We're putting people on lead, on trad. We're already doing that, so we have a responsibility already. It's not like we can just avoid psychologically challenging things or talk. We're already doing that, and that's kind of the point of climbing for me, is to kind of bring yourself into that space. So, again, I'm putting my foot in it a lot here, but I do think that is what much of the value of climbing is having something psychologically challenging, and just having, so what I'm asking you guys here is that if there is a level of training that is kind of accessible to instructors, as you've said, like a mental health first aid, or that kind of area that gives us basic principles that we can work on, where we don't need a foundation of an MSc in psychology. Or
I think the first thing I would say in terms of that psychological risk assessment, I personally, the way I do this is think, does the person have the capacity and the psychological skills to cope with, and sometimes actually the technical skills, to cope with the demands of what they're about to do? Mm-hmm. So in a competition, do they have the ability to regulate their emotions effectively, or even vaguely, to be honest? Is this going to overwhelm them? Because for me, going back to your earlier point about trauma, if somebody doesn't have the skills or the capacity or I don't want to say resilience, because that sounds judgmental and I don't mean it to, but if they don't have the capacity for the situation they're going into, they can get overwhelmed. And overwhelm is a sliding scale from a few tears right the way through to, a big trauma. And unfortunately, my view of trauma, which I've kind of taken from Bessel van der Kolk, is anytime you feel that your capacity to deal with situation is completely overwhelmed. So that could be somebody who just gets absolutely petrified on the wall. It doesn't have to be a catastrophic event where somebody gets really hurt, or, the big T stuff that we hear about. It could be something that when you look at it is relatively minor, but to them it's absolutely not minor. So.
Yeah, there's also the repetition of it, isn't there? And we have one trial learning when it comes to fear and trauma. It's like you only need one event for that to be ingrained for a long time, but it can be ingrained repetitively over time. And this is what is really important to understand about fear of falling, is that you can even just witness a really bad fall and you've got that fear ingrained, or you could just multiple times put yourself in situations where you just don't quite have the psychological resources for it, but like saying about this capacity, and that also can ingrain fear. And that's why it's so easy to do fall practice wrong, because every time you're doing the fall practice, you could actually just be pushing it a bit too far, getting that psychological challenge level a bit wrong, and then therefore ingraining that fear. I am aware that we were supposed to be talking about competition climbing.
No, I think all of this still applies, because I would say the physical risk at competition is considerably lower than if you're climbing outside. Please argue with me if you disagree, because I welcome that. But I think the psychological challenge maybe is greater in some ways, because there's a lot more emphasis on its public. There's a lot of people watching. I've worked in competitions for a long time, and there's often a big problem with particularly women not handing in their scorecards at the end of the round.
Right, okay.
Just because they, and I understand. I think anybody who dares to compete is an absolute hero in my mind. It's a huge thing to do, to put yourself out there in that way. Yeah. And that's a whole challenge in itself.
Yeah, maybe let's move on to that. Like, what are kind of the main psychological challenges you see with competitors? Is that there's this social element? How does that actually sort of manifest itself when you're working with someone?
Gosh, it changes so much depending on what age groups you're working with. Maybe this is a generalisation and it's highly anecdotal, so I'm not going to pretend this is all super evidence-based, but my experience has been there seems to be two major challenge points for young people who are competing. One is at 12, the other is at about 16. So the 12-year-olds, it's, that horrible, I'm sure we all remember it, that horrible transition from being a child to being a teenager. And it hits them like a bus. And it's that trying to regulate their emotions is hard enough just sitting still doing nothing. So putting themselves out there and really trying to compete against others when they don't really have the maturity yet to process what their experiences are often results, you'll see a lot of kids crying at competitions with parents who are completely besides themselves going, why am I letting my child do this? But 90% of the time it's the young person that's driving it, not the parent, which is interesting in itself because a lot of people can be maybe a bit judgmental, going, why are they here?
I've seen a little bit of the other side of that though, actually, where the parent can be driving it in. Yeah.
I just find it interesting because maybe those people don't really come to me. I don't really see the pushy parents.
Yeah.
I only see parents who are really wanting the best for their kid and don't know how to facilitate that because it's such an alien thing.
What I often see is it's not necessarily like the quintessential pushy parent, but it's the values that are exchanged and the value, and this happens a lot just in our society in general, but the value of happiness comes through achievement, and not through your development and the process and the learning and the experiences and the meeting new people. It's very much we all value achievement in this family, and therefore my child will be happy. They still want their kid to be happy, but they see happiness come through the achievement only. I don't know if you've got anything to say to that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends about how they define achievement, because something I really encourage from as early as they are able to process this is thinking more about mastery goals. So what intentions or goals can you set for competition day that has nothing to do with where you place or whether you top something?
Yeah.
So it could be, I want to go and give it my best go, but my best shot. I want to leave it all out there on the mats. I want to...
Yeah.
If I have a moment where I feel I'm challenged, I'm able to regulate myself, or things like that, so that those parents can then, when they see their child do the thing that they wanted to achieve, they can go nuts and celebrate that, because those things usually will be very transferable to other things as well. And it's getting them more into that mastery mindset, which I think can be much more solid over time, rather than if I'm looking at where I am in relation to others, that's not stable over time. I could have a bad day, they could have a bad day. It's very fraught and unstable as a source of confidence, for example.
So yeah, I mean
that's
like what we teach on this in the Strong Mind course and stuff. Totally, that idea of achievement. I found it kind of tricky to get people to shift to more. So the way we talk about it is changing your idea of success and failure. So yeah, success would be trying your hardest rather than winning, for example, And as you say, it's not only more stable, but it's also like more process oriented. So like people, when they go to perform, they're more present with their experience when their metric of success is, I want to try hard, because you try hard in the moment, whereas winning happens in some point in the future. So it takes your attention away. How easy do you find it to shift competitors? Because obviously competitive people, a lot of the people we work with, some people are competitors, but usually they're not, and it can be difficult to shift them away from that. Like say they're projecting a route. Sometimes people are projecting that route and they arrive at that project with the mindset of, I want to achieve this thing, and all my energy and focus is to this end point, and it's not actually in the process. But competitors are usually competitive people, right? They want to win. So what methods do you have especially, do you work with adults as well, or do you mostly kids? Yeah, maybe you can speak a bit about that, and maybe is it easier with adults or actually harder?
I think that's a really good point, and one I really wanted to come back to. I think we also can't be afraid of wanting to win. Like, I don't know whether it's a British thing, but I think some people are quite afraid of saying, I really want to win. There's a vulnerability in admitting that. And I think competition climbing is so brutally hard on every possible metric I can think of, that you have to really want to be there. Otherwise, why would you not just be out on the rock having a lovely time? Admittedly, I understand projecting is not always a lovely time, but you can at least have good days on real rock, whereas competition climbing, it's much more, you have no control over whether you have a great success or not, because there's so many factors that go into it. So there's that aspect of, I think you have to really want to win and to show yourself. I mean, there may be some people who just really love the setting style, but I just don't believe that's going to be enough to keep you doing it when the challenges really start coming thick and fast. So in a nutshell, it's not about getting them, I think for competition climbers, and this is where there's a big difference between comp climbers and outdoor people and recreational climbers, is that you don't want to completely shift their mindset away from having a focus a little bit on outcome. But I think it needs to be a bit more balanced for them.
Yeah,
so you need to give them ways to win that don't involve beating other people.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, because it's so unforgiving. I know with projecting, I know it can be kind of similar, where you reach a stopper point, or you can't quite link something together, or and it's relentless and it's just not quite coming together. It's quite hard to get wins in that situation in terms of feeling like you can keep going. And I think comp climbing can be the same. But if there's like, okay, well, at least I was able to do X, Y, or Z that I could control, then it's just enough to keep you motivated, to keep you in it for long enough to start succeeding.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I was going to ask, how do you actually balance that? What does that look like, that balance between having the drive to wanting to win and sort of adopting a bit of a mastery mindset?
Good question. I think it comes behaviourally. So it would be, if we're creating sort of competition routines or competition plans, it would be just making sure that there are some goals that they have a bit of ownership of and are able to manage. So like that whole control the controllables thing that is bandied around a lot in Olympic sport. It's that kind of aspect. So it could be in their preparation, when they're thinking about their goals for the next competition, you make sure they've got a couple of mastery goals in there so that there's a little bit of balance. It's not something I think that comes naturally for most people, but I would say the real high performers that I've spoken to and worked with will naturally do that anyway. They will be slightly more me against me to a certain degree. But I think we'd be lying if we didn't say that the top performers didn't really, really want to win. Because ultimately there comes a point in some routes where it's just your whole body is screaming at you. You're really uncomfortable. You're not really sure if you can make the next move. And realistically, it's the ones who are like, I am not letting go because I really want to win. They'll have that extra motivation to push.
I would probably disagree with that though, because like I feel like that's something I'm really good at, is that trying hard. And that trying hard, I find that if it comes from that place of wanting to win, or for me, I mean, I used to be a competitor, but for me now it's more achieve the goal. That actually makes me less likely to try hard in those moments, because when you feel that on the edge, it, especially I guess with competition climbing, it's actually in a way it's almost easier to try harder because you're marked on how high you get, whereas with project climbing you fail if you don't clip the chains. So like one of my kind of real strengths is that trying hard even when all the odds are against me getting to the top, but it's actually letting go of that achievement for me, that, and just like, it's almost like you give in to the effort itself. It's like this really weird state of mind, and it's almost like a contradiction in itself. But yeah, I know what you're saying. That extra external motivator is really powerful, because what we're talking about here is we're talking about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation as well, aren't we? And I really think that what you're saying is totally valid. Like that, those extrinsic external motivators of the desire to win, have that status and that social validation and stand on the podium and get the check and the raise from your sponsors. I mean, of course they're motivators. But I quite like this analogy of like, when you're you're running the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics, having someone literally on your tail, that's a classic external motivator, right? They're literally chasing you. And that might give you that extra little bit of oomph. Why not harness that? Of course, you can harness that. But if you're thinking about a lifetime of dedication to the sport, it's never going to be... The best climbers are never going to be the ones that are solely externally motivated.
Yeah.
Because the external motivators often come later. They're not in the moment. Whereas like actually loving climbing, loving trying hard, loving being in that space of like pure effort, those internal, intrinsic motivators, and they are just more powerful and they're more moment to moment. And, you know, like Shauna Coxey, probably our best ever competitor, right? You can tell she loves climbing. Like all of her videos, she's just so in it. And I think the competitors who do best, they want to win. But when they show up on the mat, they are in the moment and they're not thinking of the winning when they're climbing. And for whatever reason, they have that psychological skill to use those two motivations as focusing tools rather than distractors.
Massively. And I think the key separator in those factors is this idea of desperation.
Right.
If you're desperate to win,
you need it.
Then I think that can really unstick you. Because the second, I totally agree, and I think maybe I should have explained it better. Because I think if you're on the wall thinking about your place or I need to get that hold or whatever, that's all distraction, because none of those thoughts are actually going to get you to that position. Mm-hmm. The only thing it might do for you is give you that motivation of having that person just right behind you, chasing you. Mm-hmm. But if it's not motivating you, it's just noise. It's not going to actually help you win or achieve that block. You have to be fully present with that effort. And I think if you don't love that effort, then it's going to get really hard. And that's, I said there's 2 points. When you're 16, that's the second point. Right. I say 16, give or take a year or two, depending on where they're at. But life gets serious. The competition field changes massively at 16. I think you become eligible to start competing as a senior, which completely changes the game.
Right.
And those ones I often see kids who've maybe kind of not really ever had to try to win before, and all their bodies change. They're not where they used to be. They start experiencing pump, which really sucks when imagine you've been able to climb super hard and then boom, suddenly you're pumped. Sucks. So all of that stuff hits you at the same time. And if you don't really love putting in effort, it's going to be really difficult to kind of overcome that. And that's not to say that's not a skill that can be learned. Mm-hmm. I know for me, effort was not something I particularly loved about climbing. It wasn't until I started fingerboarding that I understood what effort actually was. Because I was like, my entire body is screaming at me to just step off, put your foot down, run away, go and eat cake. Like, I don't want to do this. But actually, that was really transferable for me. So now I know what effort actually feels like. I actually try when I'm climbing. So it's not to say you can't learn it, not to say I'm some badass hardcore climber, but I think everybody, wherever your baseline is in terms of how much effort you can tolerate, because
as a practice skill for sure, I've got better at it over the course of my career massively.
You've talked about it quite a lot, Hazel, and it's probably one of your big talents. I think one of your biggest talents in climbing is trying hard. Right.
Yeah.
But I suppose you've described it there as an intrinsic motivator that allows you to try out. You enjoy being there, you enjoy the moment, and you actually, sometimes it's like the effort becomes a goal. But it sounds like, Emma, you were describing that you could try hard and have an extrinsic motivator that wasn't a distractor. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. It's very rare.
Right.
But I have seen it. Some of the best climbers I know actually have that ability to make it a motivator rather than a distraction. I think that's maybe where the special sauce is with it, is that you're able to then, in that moment where everything is screaming at you, you're able to use it as no, I really want to make the podium. I'm going to give this an ungodly amount of effort to try and get to the next hold. Because actually with comp climbing, that actually might be the difference. Just a plus. just making a movement off the next could be the difference between a podium or not, you know?
I guess we don't know often though what's in their heads, right? It's like it could be that they're just so well trained at giving effort that that's what they do in the moment. They're not thinking what this is about or anything. It's just, you know, the good competitor will literally go to the death, you know, and what day they will, and that's what they do. But I think, coming back to your point before about this desperation, I think that, you know, it's such a good point, because that's when it becomes a distractor. And I think the reason it becomes a distractor, and maybe the core of what we're trying to differentiate here, is to be super basic but just positive and negative. You know, some people just think that the idea of that pressure, that competitive pressure, and having someone on their tail, it makes them be more present, be more positive, be more engaged in the challenge, and they feel good about all of that. Whereas some people, it's a negative. It's, oh no, there's someone who's going to be, you know, some people want to win easily. Some people thrive with the idea of having someone right on their tail pushing them, you know? It's like that healthy competitiveness versus unhealthy competitiveness, isn't it? And you see the same thing in project climbing. Some people show up to the project, actually just like wrote an Instagram post about this, but yeah, it's from this place of lacking, you know, I'm not whole, but I'll feel okay when I've achieved this goal. Or you can show up going, you know, I feel okay about myself right now, actually. I'm in a good place psychologically, and this achievement is a cherry on top, and this challenge is just a wonderful thing, you know, that's just, I feel great about, you know. It's just such a different way of approaching challenge, isn't it, I suppose?
Completely. I completely agree, and I think it's a really complicated one. I've seen it both ways in multiple people I've worked with, where some people really thrive on pressure. Whether that's pressure of someone being right over their shoulder, or knowing they've got to reach a certain point in the wall to even stand a chance of qualifying, let alone anything else. Some people thrive on that. Some people just get crushed by that. And it's really individual. It's really personal. And I wouldn't like to say which one's right or wrong. I don't want this to be I don't want there to be a judgment about that, because it's all about what's working for the person. Because it can go, that pressure, thriving under pressure can actually be quite a challenging thing as well. So it's not about it being right or wrong. It's just, is it working for you? Is that strategy actually working?
But how would thriving under pressure not ever lead to a better performance than not thriving?
So,
like they might just be not motivated enough or something, because they're so happy and more content that actually they're like almost blasé about it or something. Whereas the person who is like crushing, they're like, try harder or something. Isn't it sometimes happen?
I think in terms of thriving under pressure, usually that has to be teamed with quite a high level of confidence. And if they have a confidence knock for any reason, then that thriving can take a massive dip. And then suddenly they're experiencing that crushing sensation without having ever developed the tools to deal with it. So it can kick them harder in a way, because if you're somebody who is competing and gets kind of really struggles with that pressure, you have to learn early to manage that. If that's how you arrived. So you'll be learning to deal with that in kind of tandem with the level of challenge that you're facing physically, hopefully. Whereas if you've cruised it and you thrive under pressure because you've got this confidence, like, yeah, I know I can smash it, and then you have a knock, whether you have a little accident or whether you just don't do as well as you thought, or a mistake or whatever it is, or you hit 16 and the field becomes absolutely ridiculously hard to make progress in, suddenly it's like, oh, maybe I don't have this. And then that they have to learn these skills when the challenge level is way high. And that can be it's not insurmountable. It can definitely be dealt with. But I think it's not fun. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So what are the strategies there to protect that confidence?
Thanks for listening. In the second part of this podcast, we continue to talk about how to protect our confidence when facing unknowns. breaking down challenges, being more practice-oriented, mind tools and psychological strategies. Emma teaches competitors to prepare them for the unknown of competition routes, visualization for scary trad routes, introversion, self-awareness, the inability to manage fear because of lack of self-awareness, what it means to be brave, why we're not here to eradicate fear, but to learn how to manage it, approaching fear carefully, fear as an opportunity, arousal levels in sport, and fear as actually an aid to performance in some situations, under versus overstimulation in climbing, and psychological strategies for public speaking. So there's a lot in this second half. If you're not a podcast member already, you can head to strongmindclimbing.com/podcast to listen to the second half of this episode. There you'll find a private RSS feed with all of our extra bonus content. All right, thanks so much for your time and attention, and I hope you have a great day.